Welcome back to Reform Thinking. This is the show where we take the text, the ideas, the history that shapes our faith, and we really dig into them. Today we're looking at something many people just, well, skip over. Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. The genealogy of Jesus Christ. You know, it looks like just a long list of names, maybe a bit dry. But our mission today is to see it for what it really is. It's not just filler. Matthew crafted this as a powerful opening statement. Think of it like the royal credentials for Jesus and really the doctrinal thesis for his whole gospel.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's easy to miss just how carefully constructed this is. Matthew isn't just listing ancestors. He's doing something quite brilliant theologically. He's establishing two massive claims right off the bat. First, Jesus' absolute legal right to the throne of David. That's crystal clear. But at the same time, he's pointing to the supernatural nature of Jesus' arrival. And the way he does it shows this incredible truth. God brings his Messiah, his Christ, through sinful people and for sinful people. It's pure grace right there on page 1 of the New Testament.
Okay, let's start right at verse 1. The book of the origin of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That opening phrase in Greek, textalos geneseōs, book of origin or record of genealogy. Why is that specific choice of words so significant right away?
Oh, it's hugely significant. That phrase, textalos geneseōs, it's not common in the New Testament. In fact, it's unique here. And for anyone familiar with the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, it would immediately ring a bell. It echoes Genesis.
Genesis, how so? Like the creation account?
Well, specifically, it echoes the textilated headings you find throughout Genesis. You know, phrases like, this is the account of, or these are the generations of.
Ah, right. Like in Genesis 2.4, the account of the heavens and the earth, or 5.1, the book of the generations of Adam, those headings.
Exactly those. And in Genesis, those textilated headings weren't just family trees. They were markers. They introduced the next major section, the next stage in God's unfolding plan. They signaled what came next in the story.
So Matthew, grabbing that specific phrase, is like him saying, hold on, this isn't just more history. This is something new starting, like a whole new chapter or even a whole new book.
That's precisely it. He's framing the entire story of Jesus not just as, you know, another entry in the family album, but as a new creation moment. It's a signal, maybe a subtle one to us, but powerful then, that with Jesus, the story of the world is, in a way, starting over. This is the restoration. This is the goal, the texlos goal that creation was always heading towards.
Wow. So Jesus isn't just the endpoint of Israel's story, he's the start of. Everything's fresh start.
That's the idea. The whole gospel is being presented as the story of this new beginning brought about by this king.
And you mentioned he connects this idea of origin, this text Genesis later on.
Yes, and it's very neat, very intentional, I think. He uses the same root word, text Genesis, again in verse 18. Right when he starts describing the birth of Jesus, he says, text Genesis Jesus Christ was like this, linking the historical lineage, the genealogy traced through Joseph, directly to the miraculous origin through Mary by the Holy Spirit.
So the history and the miracle are tied together linguistically, one single coherent origin story orchestrated by God.
Exactly. Providence guides the historical line, the Spirit brings about the new creation event, and Matthew uses the language to show they are two parts of the same divine plan. It's beautifully done.
Okay, that sets a huge stage. Now let's tackle something in that first verse that seems, well, odd. The order. Son of David, son of Abraham. David came, what, 1,000 years after Abraham? Why put David first? Chronology seems out the window here.
It is. And that tells you immediately that Matthew's driving concern isn't strict historical sequence. It's theology. By putting son of David right up front, he's shouting his main theme to the rooftop. Jesus is the king, the royal heir, the one with the legitimate claim to the throne of Israel.
That's the absolute first thing he wants you to know about Jesus, before anything else.
Absolutely. Is this man the promised king? Yes. That's the headline. And then the title that follows, text versus Christ, is defined by that. It's not a last name. It means anointed one, specifically the anointed king promised to David in 2 Samuel 7. So lead with David to find Christ as the king. The whole gospel narrative is framed from verse 1 as covenant history reaching its royal peak.
If he'd said son of Abraham first, the emphasis might have been different, maybe on blessing or being part of Israel.
Possibly. Or priestly lines or just national identity. But leading with David, it locks the focus onto the throne, onto kingship. It's unmistakable.
Okay, so the legal right to rule is paramount. That brings up the phrase son of textoios. We hear son and think biology, but you're saying it worked differently in that context.
Yes, and this is really important for understanding the whole genealogy, especially how it ends. The word textoios, son, certainly could mean biological son, but it carried a much broader legal and covenantal weight. Meaning, sonship primarily conferred status, inheritance rights, and legal standing. And crucially, this status could be established legally through things like adoption, not just through blood relation.
So being declared someone's son legally gave you all the rights and privileges even without the DNA connection.
Correct. Think about adoption laws even today, though the context was different. An adopted son was fully the son in terms of name, property, legal rights. Matthew is priming his readers with this understanding of textoios.
Well, to prepare for Joseph.
Exactly. It lays the groundwork. By establishing up front that sonship is fundamentally a legal covenantal category, Matthew makes it possible for us to understand how Jesus can be the legal heir of David, inheriting the rights through Joseph.
Even though Joseph isn't his biological father.
Precisely. It allows Joseph's later actions, accepting Mary, naming Jesus, to be seen as legally decisive acts that confer the Davidic inheritance and rights onto Jesus. It builds the legal framework for both the history and the miracle to hold true.
Okay, so the order is clear. David first emphasizes the kingship, the legal claim. Then Abraham brings in the wider purpose, the global scope. Matthew presents Jesus as fulfilling both covenants. And as we understand it theologically, these two major Old Testament covenants, Davidic and Abrahamic, are administrations of the one overarching covenant of grace, right?
That's a good way to frame it from a systematic perspective, yes. They represent key phases or aspects of how God administered his plan of grace before Christ fully arrived.
So let's dig into the Davidic claim first. How does the genealogy itself function as evidence for this kingship, beyond just listing names?
Well, the Davidic covenant is all about God's promise of an everlasting throne for David's line. You see that clearly in 2 Samuel 7, Psalm 89. Matthew's genealogy isn't just a casual list. It's structured like a legal document. Think of it as Exhibit A in the case for Jesus' kingship. It's designed to prove his legal standing as the heir to those promises.
And part of that design, that structure, involves numbers, right? This is where it gets maybe a little obscure for us today, the gematria.
Yeah, the numerical pattern. It's subtle, but it's definitely there and pretty significant. Matthew himself points it out in verse 17. He summarizes the whole list. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations.
3 sets of 14. Why 14? That seems very specific.
It is specific, and it points directly to David. It involves gematria, which was a common practice where letters in Hebrew also had numerical values.
Okay, how does that work for David?
David's name in Hebrew is spelled Dale, Vevav, Tele. The letter Dale has the value 4. The letter Vav has the value 6.
So 4 plus 6 plus 4
equals 14.
Wow. So Matthew is arranging the entire sweep of Israel's history into 3 blocks of 14, essentially as a way to embed David's name numerically into the very structure of the list.
That's exactly what seems to be happening. This 3 by 14 structure is like a watermark or a signature woven into the fabric of the genealogy. It's constantly, silently pointing back to David. It's saying this whole history, it moves in patterns related to David. This lineage is fundamentally royal. It's another layer of proof, almost a hidden code, confirming Jesus as the promised Davidic heir.
That's quite something. Okay, so he hammers home the Davidic, royal, very Israel-focused claim with the structure. But then right in verse 1, he immediately adds son of Abraham. What does that layer add? Why not just stick with David?
Because adding son of Abraham instantly broadens the horizon. It defines the purpose and the scope of this Davidic king's reign. It pulls the camera back from just Jerusalem and the throne of Israel to encompass, well, the entire world. It makes the reader remember the foundational promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 22, that in Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed.
So the king is the king of Israel, but he's also the king for the nations. It prevents a narrow nationalistic reading.
Exactly. Matthew refuses to let the kingship be seen as just, a political restoration for Israel alone. The inclusion of Abraham ensures we understand the universal dimension right from the start.
So the two covenants converge here. The Davidic king is actually the way God fulfills the global promise to Abraham.
Precisely stated. The royal particularity, the specific legal line of David, exists to serve the goal of global grace. The King of the Jews is the Savior of the world. That's the dynamic Matthew sets up.
And this isn't just an opening theme, is it? It shapes the whole book.
It absolutely dictates the trajectory. Think about how Matthew ends his gospel. The Great Commission. What is it? It's the resurrected king, clothed in Davidic authority. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, sending his disciples out to fulfill the Abrahamic promise. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations.
The end loops right back to the beginning. The king's authority flows into the mission to bless the world.
Perfectly. The superscription in 1.1 is the interpretive key. Read everything that follows through this lens. Davidic kingship enacted for Abrahamic blessing.
And connecting this to our systematic framework like the Westminster Confession, this shows how those Old Testament covenants work together under the umbrella of the covenant of grace.
I think it illustrates it very well. You see, the Davidic covenant focused maybe more on the physical line, the earthly kingdom, the throne, and the Abrahamic covenant with its emphasis on the spiritual seed, faith, and that global scope. Matthew shows Christ as the one who embodies and fulfills both. He's the mediator, the substance of God's grace administered through these different historical phases. He's the reality that both covenants pointed towards.
So Matthew's building this careful case. The structure, the numbers, the sequence, it all points to Jesus's legal right as king. But then he does something fascinating. He seems to intentionally disrupt his own pattern. Let's start with the main pattern itself, that repeated verb, text agonos.
Yes, the list moves forward with this very steady, almost monotonous beat. Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob. Text at that verb, he fathered, repeated over and over in the aorist active tense, creates this legal cadence.
Like reading out a legal document, affirming each link in the chain.
Exactly, it has that feel. It suggests lawful succession, continuity, historical transmission of the right, link after link, generation after generation, the line is preserved. It argues by accumulation.
It also suggests God's hand is in the ordinary, doesn't it? Even in the generations we know almost nothing about, like Hezron or Ram, the line just continues.
That's a great point. It affirms God's providence working through the normal means of family and procreation. Covenant history isn't always spectacular. A lot of it is quiet faithfulness, preserving the line down through the centuries. God's decree moves forward even when things seem unremarkable.
Okay, so that's the steady beat. But then Matthew throws in these wrinkles, these deliberate breaks in the rhythm. The most obvious one is the inclusion of women. That wasn't standard practice in genealogies back then, was it?
Not at all. Genealogies were overwhelmingly male-focused because they traced lineage, property, and status, which typically passed through the father. Matthew, including women, and these specific women, is highly unusual and intentional.
He lists 4 before Mary: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. Why them? There were other important women in the lineage, like Sarah or Rebecca. They seem selected.
Very much selected. And the common thread isn't piety or status. It's actually the opposite. They represent significant irregularity, foreign status, or even moral scandal within the line. Their inclusion acts like little flags popping up in the list. They're signals about the nature of grace. They announce that this holy God works his purposes even through brokenness, through outsiders, through sinners. They foreshadow the gospel message itself.
Okay, let's take them one by one. Tamar. Her story in Genesis 38 is messy.
Understatement. It involves deception, prostitution, Judah's failure to uphold levirate marriage customs. It's fraught with problems. But Matthew includes her. Why? Probably to show God preserving the promised line despite human sin and failure. Tamar, in a strange way, acts to ensure the line continues when Judah fails. And the story ends with Judah confessing, "She is more righteous than I." It shows the line depends not on human perfection, but on God's sovereign oversight and even human repentance within that messy history.
Okay. Then we get Rahab and Ruth, and they bring in that Gentile element we talked about with Abraham.
Right. Rahab was a Canaanite from Jericho. Ruth was a Moabitess. Both were foreigners, outsiders to the covenant people, and not just any foreigners. Canaanites were under God's judgment. Moabites were explicitly excluded from the assembly by the law in Deuteronomy. Including them here is radical. It's Matthew showing that Gentile inclusion isn't just a New Testament idea. It's woven into the very fabric of the royal line from way back.
So their inclusion shows God's mercy overriding judgment or legal exclusion.
Exactly. Mercy triumphs. Rahab, the former prostitute who hid the spies by faith. Ruth, the loyal Moabitess widow who clung to Naomi and Yahweh. They're grafted in by grace and faith. And Ruth's story, of course, beautifully highlights the theme of the kinsman redeemer, the text go. Boaz stepping up to redeem Ruth and Naomi's inheritance is a powerful type of foreshadowing of Christ himself who redeems his people. So these women inject themes of grace, faith, Gentile inclusion, and redemption right into the kingly line.
Incredible. Okay, that's the first kind of break the women. Then there's another major interruption, right? It happens at David.
Yes, the structure itself pauses almost at David.
Yeah.
Matthew gives him a unique designation. He's not just David. In verse 6, it's David the king. He's the only one in that whole first section to get a title.
Like a spotlight hitting him. The summit of that part of the list?
Precisely. It marks him out. Here he is, the great ancestor, the standard bearer for the promise. You're meant to recognize his significance.
But then Matthew does something rhetorically stunning. Right after calling him the king, he hits us with the darkest moment of David's reign.
It's incredibly bold. David the king fathered Solomon by the wife of Uriah. He doesn't even use Bathsheba's name initially. He uses the phrase that directly recalls David's horrific sin, adultery and the murder of a loyal soldier.
Wow. Talk about juxtaposition. Crown him and then immediately point out his greatest shame. Why do that? Why not just smooth it over? Mention Solomon came from David, period.
Because Matthew is making a profound theological point. He's guarding against any kind of, ethnic pride or triumphalism based on the monarchy. He's saying, yes, David is the king, the line is royal, the promise is real, but don't you dare think this kingdom or this Messiah is founded on human perfection or sanitized history. By placing David's kingship right next to his terrible sin, Matthew teaches a crucial lesson. The kingship is real, but grace is absolutely necessary. God's covenant faithfulness persists despite, not because of, the moral record of the kings. It forces you to look beyond David to the God who maintains the promise even through profound failure.
Okay, so Matthew has established the legal line with that steady texties beat, but he's also woven in grace through the inclusion of the women and the honest portrayal of David's sin. Now, we arrive at the very end of the list, verse 16. This is the final and perhaps most significant break in the pattern.
It really is the climax of the genealogy's internal logic. That relentless active voice, he fathered, which has carried us through 40 links, suddenly stops. It's broken decisively right at the connection between Joseph and Jesus.
How exactly does the language change in verse 16?
Let's look closely. It says, and Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom, which is feminine in Greek, pointing only to Mary, Jesus was born, who is called Christ. See the shift. It's not Joseph fathered Jesus. The verb changes from the active text to the passive text was born, and the relative pronoun text makes it clear Mary is the one from whom he was born.
So the grammar itself builds a wall, so to speak, between Joseph's line of fathering and Jesus's actual origin. The agency shifts. It's no longer human begetting. Something else happened.
Exactly. The passive voice points away from Joseph as the source of conception. This grammatical shift is Matthew's careful way of safeguarding the doctrine of the virgin conception. It signals the unique, supernatural initiative of the Holy Spirit. Jesus' origin is different from everyone else in the list. Those earlier inclusions of women with their irregularities might have even prepared the reader, in a way, for this ultimate divine irregularity, God stepping in directly.
So the grammar protects the miracle, but then why all the effort to trace the line meticulously down to Joseph if he's not the biological father? What's Joseph's role here? It seems crucial, but how?
His role is absolutely essential, but it's juridical, not biological. Joseph provides the necessary legal link for Jesus to inherit the Davidic promises. Remember, the covenant promise was made to David's line, his house. It required legal descent.
Without Joseph, Jesus wouldn't have a legal claim to the throne, even with a miraculous birth.
Correct. Under the terms of the covenant, as understood then, he needed to be legally incorporated into the house and lineage of David. Joseph provides that vital connection.
And how does Joseph do that, legally speaking?
Through his actions described just after the genealogy, in verses 18-25. Specifically, by taking Mary as his wife, despite the circumstances, and crucially, by publicly naming the child Jesus.
The act of naming was a formal legal step.
Yes. In that culture, the father naming the child was a formal act of acknowledgement and acceptance. It conferred legitimacy, and in this case, it legally established Jesus as Joseph's son, thereby grafting him into the Davidic line and conferring upon him all the associated covenantal rights and the claim to the throne.
So Matthew is carefully navigating two things at once here.
Exactly. It's like he's running on two parallel tracks. Track one is the active voice, tracing the legal historical line right down to Joseph, fulfilling the covenant requirement. Track two is the passive voice, pointing to Mary and safeguarding the miraculous divine origin of Jesus through the Spirit. Both are essential for who Jesus is, the fully legitimate Davidic king and the unique Son of God.
We've seen the historical detail, the literary structure, the grammatical precision. Matthew builds this incredibly tight case. Let's pull back a bit now and connect this genealogy to some broader systematic theological truths. Starting with God's providence, how does this list illustrate that?
Well, the whole genealogy is a stunning display of God's providence, as outlined, for instance, in the Westminster Confession, chapter 5. Providence is God's purposeful governing of all things. Here, Matthew shows it working on multiple levels. First, there's the sheer historical continuity. God sovereignly orders history, preserving this specific lineage through centuries, wars, exile, obscurity, ensuring that the legal line remains intact until the fullness of time. That's providence in the ordinary. Second, there's providence in the extraordinary. God doesn't just oversee the historical process, he directly intervenes through the Spirit to bring about the birth of the Messiah. So providence governs both the natural descent and the supernatural origin.
And it's a providence that isn't derailed by human sin, right? That seems key here.
Absolutely key. That's maybe the most powerful testimony to God's providence in this list. Look at the names, the failures, the scandals, Tamar's deception, Rahab's background, David's horrific sin, the whole nation's sin leading to exile. God's plan doesn't get thwarted by human failure. In fact, his providence is so comprehensive that he even works through these failures, weaving them into his unstoppable purpose of bringing the Messiah. It shows his decree stands firm because he is faithful, not because the human links in the chain were flawless.
It really underscores that his purposes will prevail, which leads naturally into thinking about grace and justification. How does the genealogy preach that?
It's like a giant neon sign pointing to justification by grace alone. As you read through the names, especially the ones Matthew highlights, you realize this is not a list of heroes earning their spot through merit. It's what some have called a ledger of grace. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, David. Their inclusion demolishes any idea of salvation through pedigree or moral performance. If God can work through this lineage to bring his Holy One, then his salvation clearly isn't based on human righteousness.
It confirms that Christ came for the ungodly, as Paul would later argue.
Precisely. WCF chapter 11 on justification talks about God pardoning sinners and accounting them righteous, not for anything in them, but for Christ's sake alone, received by faith. This genealogy prepares you for that. It shows the raw material God works with. David, the great king, is highlighted with his sin, showing that even the best need grace. God's promise holds because of his faithfulness, not David's.
And you mentioned Joseph's role earlier. How does his legal action connect to our understanding of grace, maybe specifically adoption?
It's a beautiful picture, I think, of the forensic nature of grace, particularly adoption, WCF 12. Joseph, by his legal act of naming Jesus, confers upon him the status and rights of the Davidic heir, even without a biological link. In a parallel way, God the Father, through our union with Christ, declares us to be his children. It's a legal declaration, a change in status. We aren't born into God's family naturally. We are adopted. We receive the full rights and inheritance of sons and daughters, not based on our spiritual DNA or performance, but solely based on God's gracious declaration because of what Christ, the true Son, has done.
So Joseph legally bringing Jesus into the royal family is like a preview of God legally bringing us into his family, a change of status by declaration.
Exactly. It's a forensic act. Just as Joseph's naming placed Jesus legally in David's line, God's act of adoption places believers legally into his family, making us co-heirs with Christ. The genealogy provides the historical backdrop for understanding this kind of declarative, status-changing grace.
And finally, what about the church? We touched on the Gentiles Rahab and Ruth. What does their inclusion signal for ecclesiology, for the nature of the church?
It's foundational. Including Rahab the Canaanite and Ruth the Moabite, right there in the Messiah's official lineage, is a powerful preview of the Catholicity, the universality of the New Covenant Church, WCF XXV. It tells Matthew's largely Jewish audience from the outset. God's plan always included the Gentiles. They aren't a plan B or a later addition. They were, as one writer put it, stitched into the royal line from the beginning. It anticipates the breaking down of the dividing wall.
So the mission to the Gentiles, the Great Commission at the end, isn't just a final instruction. It's the logical outcome of the identity established right here in chapter 1.
Absolutely. Evangelism, making disciples of all nations, is presented as covenant obedience. It's the Davidic king, whose credentials have just been laid out, exercising his legitimate authority to gather his people from every tribe and tongue, fulfilling that ancient promise made to Abraham. The genealogy validates the king, and the king authorizes the global mission. It all ties together. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. It really transforms that opening list, doesn't it? It's not just names. It's a theological manifesto a catechism almost, teaching us about Christ's right to rule, the nature of his kingdom, and the sheer gratuity of God's grace.
That's a good word for it, catechism. It teaches us foundational truths. And maybe that analogy we touched on helps summarize it. The genealogy is like a legal deed written on miraculous paper. The deed itself, the consistent chain, that textus, the structure, proves Jesus is the legal son of David. The claim is historically grounded, legally sound. It satisfies the covenant. But the paper it's written on, the whole thing being a textog bos, a new beginning, and ending with that passive texto points to the divine intervention, the miracle. He's also the Son of God, fulfilling the promise to Abraham in a supernatural way.
So the claim is solid historically, but the origin is entirely grace, entirely divine action.
That's it. Legal right meets supernatural origin. Maybe a final thought to leave with you, the listener, is this. Matthew's genealogy shows God's sovereign plan unfolding in two ways. It moves forward through the quiet, often unseen, ordinary faithfulness of generations just living their lives, preserving the line. But it also triumphs spectacularly over even the biggest, most scandalous human failures, like Judas, like David's. So what does that mean for us? How should that shape how we view our own daily faithfulness, maybe the seemingly small things? And how should it shape how we view our own failures, our own messy family histories?
Yeah, that's something to think about.
The genealogy points away from us. It tells us, don't look to your own pedigree, good or bad, for your standing or your hope. Look to the king's credentials. They are perfect, and they are secured entirely by grace,